Slavery. Did it exist in Africa prior to the European transatlantic slave trade? We will discuss that and more after this. Welcome to Living for Black History, family. I am your host, Dr. Larry Smith. You are in a place where we are studying the fabulous history that is Black history. And believe me, as I've always said, it is very fabulous. You are here on a journey embarking all the way from pre-colonial Africa all the way to modern day Black history. So it's rich, it's full, it's great, it's complete, it's so much, it's accurate, fact-based, historian-based. It is here that you're going to find the best Black history on YouTube. So once again, family, welcome to Living for Black History. I'm Dr. Larry Smith. If you are new to this channel, if you are new to these videos and you're seeing these somewhere out on the internet because somebody shared them, go ahead and hit the subscribe button to the Living For You channel so that you can have access to this content and to much more rich content that is out there. And you can also like, comment, subscribe to the channel, but also share the videos, because the goal of this series, that is going to be a pretty lengthy series, is to share something that I have learned in my many years, 20 years of being a educator, college professor, college history professor, is that not a lot of people know about Black history. I get a lot of students who take my courses just to learn Black history, and so because of that, I have decided to come here into your homes, right with you, family, and let's discuss this and let's learn together. Let's learn about the greatness of Black history together. So like I said, like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and share the videos with your friends. Create a dialogue. Hopefully it gets you to go out and you go look at and find other things and resources, and you read more about different aspects of Black history, because I promise you, it's fabulous, it's wonderful, you're going to enjoy it. So let's get into some of the history. Last time we were here, we were discussing pre-colonial Africa, and we know that Africa was perceived in a not so positive way, in fact, as a dark continent prior to a certain time. But by the 20th century, historians began to realize the richness and the fullness of Black history prior to colonialism, prior to the transatlantic slave trade, and all of that stuff. And we know that it was so much to it. And as you saw last week, you learned that there were many different civilizations like the Bantu. There are many different languages and customs and cultures and art and things that were occurring connecting Africa to the global trade network that we didn't know before. But during the early 20th century, we began to dive into those conversations. But you guys know what this is about. You've seen the title. You saw the intro. It's about slavery, right? And I know people think, hey, when we talk about Black people, we got to talk about slavery. You're very correct. That is a very real and important and prevalent part of our history. But it is more than just what you've probably gotten in your elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. It is a richer, more complex history than just that. What we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about slavery as it existed in Africa prior to any type of colonialism, whether it is Islamic colonialism or whether it was European colonialism. Slavery did exist. Now let's be clear. Slavery isn't a new system to humanity. Slavery is one of the oldest systems to exist in humanity since the dawn of civilization. There were those who imposed slavery on others and coerced them into slavery, and there were those who willingly chose to adopt and to get into slavery for protection and for many, many other reasons. And so because of that, slavery has existed for a very long time. It is not new to humanity. And of course, Africa's no different. Part of this, my goal of the initial part of this series, is to show you that Africa wasn't a dark planet. Africa was interconnected with global trade, and Africa was no different in many ways to many of the early civilizations that you can study in humanity. And with that said, there was slavery in Africa prior to any European influence. Some of you may be familiar with some of the stories. If you're familiar with the biblical story of the Egyptians, and you know of them enslaving the Semitic people, the Israelites, the Hebrews, but you also know of them also possibly, maybe, they also enslaved other Mediterranean people. They also enslaved Nubian black people. So slavery was present in Africa in various forms, in various locations, over various periods of time. Slavery was not new to the African continent with Europeans. But there were various different types of slavery in Africa. It was, when we think of slavery, we tend to think of the transatlantic slave trade, and we tend to think of the experience mostly of chattel slavery. But there were a variety of different experiences in Africa of just chattel slavery. Chattel slavery was present, but so was serfdom, that was also present, and also people enslaved family members as a way of protection and of keeping them near. So there were many variety of different ways of slavery. I want to talk about two of the main ones because a lot of times when it comes to some of these terms, they go over our heads. And so I think it's important to talk about serfdom, and I think it's important to talk about chattel slavery. And note the differences between chattel slavery and serfdom. Chattel slavery is property slavery. It means that the enslaved person is owned by the person who has them. So say, for example, if there's a man who owns 10 chattel slaves, those 10 people are his property. By default, with chattel slavery, if those 10 people have children, the children are also the property of that slave owner. Chattel slavery is something that you can be in for the rest of your life. Chattel slavery, as a chattel slave, you can be bought or sold, or bought and sold, because you are the property of a single person or a family. When I think of chattel slavery, I think of owning animals, domesticating animals. As long as you have your animals, whether it's a cow, a dog, a cat, a chicken, or whatever, they're considered your property. So say if your dog has puppies, those puppies belong to you by default because you technically own that dog that produced the puppies. And you have free range to give puppies away, and people do it all the time, sell puppies on Craigslist or eBay or however it happens, or give them to a kennel or whatever you may do, without any respect or even permission of that dog who had those puppies, the mother or the father of those puppies. That is how I compare chattel slavery for my students. You are owned by the person, and they have whatever reign to do whatever they want to, whether it's sell you, buy you, whatever. Serfdom is different. Serfdom was more prevalent in Europe, and when we talk about European slavery, we'll dive more into serfdom. But serfdom was more of a condition of servitude. It was more so you were in debt to someone, you owed someone, or you signed a contract / indentured to work for someone, to work off a debt, and you lived either on their land or near their land or worked their land to pay off this debt. Generally, you were given rights as a serf. And over time as a serf, you were given the ability to get your freedom from the serfdom. And so with chattel slavery, the person is the property. With serfdom, the contract or the agreement is the property. So in Africa, you had all of these types of slavery. And slavery was a very diverse system in Africa. It had its own rank and file, and it wasn't a fixed or permanent status. A person's slavery status can actually change within that person's lifetime. They could be born into slavery, and they can gather their freedom in their middle age or even earlier than that. Or they could be sold to someone else who gives them their freedom, or they can buy and purchase their own freedom. But in the 400 years that we had slavery in Africa prior to European conquest and colonialization, slavery more so followed a similar pattern to Islamic slavery. When we talk about Islamic slavery, we talk about it wasn't necessarily permanent. Usually people were viewed as inhabitants over a conquered land by Muslim travelers, traders, and warriors. And they actually didn't have any legal rights. But on a religious, spiritual level, they actually were seen as spiritual equals. So they weren't seen as inferior in that regard. They were seen more as kind of your property after you have conquered their territory and they lived underneath you. So under Islamic slavery, and most of you know that under the Islamic faith, Muslims couldn't enslave other Muslims during this time. And so because of that, they would just slave the nations and the groups of people and the ethnic tribes that they would capture, the non-Muslim tribes, along the way, who sometimes converted and sometimes didn't convert to Islam. That wasn't a requirement of many Islamic warriors and Islamic leaders. But under the Islamic system, slaves could actually marry. Slaves could also have families and live relatively autonomous lives and have their own experiences. They can also earn their own independent income and not necessarily have to pay all of their income to the slave owner or the slave owning family. Even though they paid tributes and taxes, they weren't all of their livelihood wasn't taken away just because they were a slave. And in many regards, slaves could also purchase their freedom. If they had accumulated enough money independently and had made enough money to buy the freedom of themselves and their families, they actually can do that under the Islamic system of slavery. So in about the 400 years prior to European conquest and inclusion into Africa, this is what slavery was for a great deal of the Africans in West Africa, where the African American experience begins. So now it is important to understand, like I said before, that slavery has existed for a very long time. It even existed in Europe, obviously. So now let's talk about European slavery. So as I said before, slavery was not unique to the African experience. In fact, Europeans enslaved other people other than people of color as well. Actually, European communities embraced quite a few different forms of coerced labor. Even chattel slavery was experienced in Europe prior and during the Middle Ages. Before the rise of feudalism came, slaves were predominantly drawn from the Slavic heartland in Eastern Europe, hence the term slave. The term slave is a different pronunciation of the term Slav, because the Slavic people of Eastern Europe were the main source of slaves in Europe. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which ends the Middle Ages, we begin to see Europeans look south into Africa for a source of slaves. By that time, they had already been familiar with African slaves, as the Muslim travelers had taken Africans from Africa as slaves and as part of their caravans throughout their travels and their trades in Europe. But in many studies, we have found that slavery was very evident and very present in Europe. Actually, David Pelteret, he does the most exhaustive research on European slavery. He actually did many studies, but one of his focus studies studied the Anglo-Saxons. Those were the early English people. That's the origins, English. He studied them from their Norman England ancestry all the way to the late Anglo-Saxon period, which is roughly 875 to about 1125. And he saw that slavery was something that was defined by law in Europe, as resulting from birth, war captivity, and various forms of punishment. Slaves represented 10% of the English population in 1086. Slavery started to decline in the 11th century and in the 12th century. Nevertheless, we know slavery was very common in England for vagrants, for poor people who had no other options. Many times those people would be thrown into forced labor. Serfdom is the slavery that was more commonly found in Europe, in particularly Eastern Europe. Unlike slaves who were chattel, which were animals or tools, as mentioned before, serfs were considered persons with certain legal rights. They were bound to specific plots of land for which they supported themselves and paid taxes to the wealthy and to the state. They also many times were used for military service. The treatment of serfs could be coercive and even harsh many times. We know for a fact that the last serfs in Europe were released were Russian serfs released in 1861. just a few years before black slaves were released in the United States. And so, as we've said, slavery is a common thing, even present in Europe for many years prior to the incorporation of Europeans in Africa collecting slaves from Africa. But it is important to know that slavery in Africa was a much different experience, engine, and resource than it was in Europe. Europe society is based mostly on hierarchy, as we know, especially during the early years when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, 476, and really until modern times, in which you had the church that was at the top, you had the king, and they had the hierarchical system, everybody underneath. That is the epitome of the feudal system. The epitome of feudal system is hierarchy. So rank played a very important role in European slavery. Not to mention the religious values and the beliefs, the social beliefs that favored men over women, where men were considered the most valuable society, partially because most kings were kings, men. Most of the rulers and leaders in the church were men. And so because of that, you have a male-centric, male-dominated society in which men are valued. And so because of that, the value of male slaves had a higher premium for Europeans than it did in Africa. In Africa, the African leaders and their elites would actually use slaves in many different capacities. They weren't just used to process land and agriculture and things like that. They'd be used in positions as administrators. They'd be used in positions, yes, I did say that, administrators. There were some African slaves who were leaders in Africa prior to European influence and slavery. There were also slaves who were used as soldiers, slaves who were used as laborers, slaves who were used as concubines. In fact, some of the Islamic travelers actually took slaves so that they can use them through their caravans to carry their goods across the Sahara Desert and into other places where they traveled. Slaves generally were of different ethnic groups. You generally didn't see someone enslaving someone of their same ethnic groups. As I stated last week, there are many different diverse ethnic groups in Africa. And so obviously that was the basis of slavery in Africa, just as it was the basis of slavery in Europe. Anglo-Saxons and others enslaving Slavic people in different ethnic groups according to their beliefs. So generally they were obtained through warfare and things like that. When Europe comes into Africa and they start to participate in the African slave trade, they're actually going to accelerate these animosities between these different ethnic groups. And they're going to use these differences amongst each other, i.e. giving weapons to some and showing favoritism to others and not to others, creating an intensity along the ethnic lines within Africa. And we don't only just have evidence of that during the slave trade, we have evidence of that going on well into the 20th century, the late 20th century, from the European experience. And so we know of that. And so it's going to accelerate from that. But African slave traders were different. They weren't like European slave traders. First, they appreciated women first. That was more important, that they had women than anybody else. Women and children. Why? Because women and children can easily be incorporated into another system, another tribe, another ethnic group. Women are good for having babies. Obviously, that's a very important thing. Reproduction is important. And so you can make more people more part of your community, and it's easier to do that, and children are easily manipulated. But women in Africa also were responsible for the majority of agricultural work. And so when you talk about it from an agricultural level, that was because of women. Women were more of the agricultural base of Africa. And so when you enslave them, what you have is you have a base to do agriculture as well as to reproduce. Now, it is important to understand two different concepts so that you're able to see the difference between Europeanized slavery and Africanized slavery. The differences between the African Bridewealth and the European Dowry. And these are marriage arrangements that we see throughout the world, but these are two different ones that shows you how slavery mentality worked. As it relates to the European dowry, it is very centric on the man. And so when a man gets married to a woman in a European wedding, all of you know, the white dress, the suit, who generally pays for the wedding? The wife's family. Why does the wife's family generally pay for a wedding in the European-centric concept of marriage? Simple. It's simple enough. Because the husband is considered to be taking on a dependent and having to take care of the wife and having to take care of the kids. And so because of that, the consideration is that he needs to be compensated for having to take care of the wife and the kids. Well, what about the African Bridewealth? In an African Bridewealth, what happens is the husband or the future husband's family actually has to pay the wife's family for taking their family, taking their property, really, taking their resource. Because in Africa, what it's really about, it's wealth in family. It's wealth in that unit there. And so when you talk about the African marriage experience, you're actually talking about an experience in which it is important to value the woman, because the woman brings more to you. She can bear you children. She can also do agriculture. She can also do other things. And so this is why you see many things like polygamy in some of these early societies. Polygamy wasn't just about, I want to have multiple wives just because I like to have a lot of wives around me. Actually, the importance of polygamy was actually because of the value placed on women and childbearing and all the other resources that women offer as it relates to African society. So that is a huge difference in helping you understand a European-centric version of slavery and what they value versus an African-centric version. That is a simple way of letting you understand the differences between the two. But it is also important to understand that across the spectrum, the notion of freedom is different, right? In the concept that we have here in the United States and in the Western world, freedom is the absence of freedom is the fullness of being able to pretty much do however you please, whatever you want, this concept of freedom. And we envision slavery or non-freedom as the absence of that experience. So we have to understand that the concept of freedom has to be challenged a little bit in order for us to fully understand slavery in Africa versus prior to the European. As stated before, slave ownership was more so about wealth in persons in Africa. And it was not like it was in Europe, right? So you get different various slave statuses throughout in Africa. One of the things, for example, is land ownership. Whereas in Europe, land ownership can be in the hands of one person, and this idea of holding property that is exclusively yours is very much a European social construct. Whereas in Africa, land ownership was a collective rather than private. And so in no circumstance could a single African farmer sell or rent land to another as in Europe. Although in Africa, an African farmer could own and sell the products of the land, not necessarily the land itself. Land in Africa fell into the control of the state and of certain kinship groups and certain leaders, which by tradition was identified as the descendants of the land's ancestral settler. Such descendants claim hereditary use and trusteeship over the land. For some groups, a territorial deity, a god, was believed to have given the land to their initial father, mother figure that started it, and that it was more connected that way. But land was shared. And so because of that, slaves were often able to harness considerable control over their lives, even enjoy wealth, and even enjoy influence. They weren't tied to any particular land at any particular time. Some scholars, instead of looking at the idea of personal freedom as we value here in the United States and in other places, they actually look at it as not the opposite to slavery. They speak more of a continuum or various levels of unfree status in traditional Africa, with slavery at one extreme and normal lineage relations at the other. What this does is it negates the utility of the word freedom in the Western context, emphasizing that historically in Africa, social relations have been based on the group rather than the individual. In order to understand African slavery and African society, pre-European society coming in, is to understand the idea that personal freedom, personal liberty is irrelevant in early Africa. There are several historians who study this, in particular Igor Kopitov and Susan Myers, have noted that early Africa freedom was equated not with the individual liberty, but with belonging to the group, holding a subservient but nonetheless protected position within the household unit could in certain instances be perceived more positively than in contexts that link freedom and liberty. As it relates to Orlando Patterson, who studied ancient societies like Babylon and Egypt, he actually noticed the same thing in early societies where slaves could become wealthy, and that freedom was not in and of itself a valued state, since becoming free could entail a loss of status and power, or even not a protection under certain times of war. So isn't that fantastic? That's a different way of seeing it. And I know it's like mind blown, right? That this idea of freedom that we have is usually related to our individual freedom, our personal freedom, what we have. But when you think about yourself in group identity, part of the collective, then you tend to see freedom as a different thing, right? You start to see that your freedom comes in your place in the society, or your place in the family, or your place in the group, or the friendship. That is what African perception of freedom was. And so slavery wasn't always considered a negative thing. People sometimes enslaved themselves in order for protection from other nations that were warring around them. Sometimes people enslaved themselves to keep positions or to gain position. Because you were more important in the collective rather as an individual. And that is a very, very, very concept that is hard for a lot of us to understand. But it is a concept that has been around in civilizations for many, 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 many years. Early civilizations was about the group. Everybody depended on everybody for survival. And so your contribution to group activity was very important. Now, while slavery played some bearings in the economic system of in Africa, early Africa, prior to European colonialization and conquest, slavery is more so of just a commodity, part of it. And then as time goes on, once Europeans come in, then slaves become more of an important commodity. Because prior to that, you had things that we talked about last week, like grains and gold and salt and cattle and animal livestock, different types of things that was present in Africa that were more important commodities than slaves. Slaves were a small portion of that. But for Europeans, after the 15th century, you're going to see an influx of their desire and their need for slaves as a commodity, as a resource, as someone or something to be bought and sold. And they're going to come in huge numbers. And as we'll talk about later, but as we already know, millions of people are going to be removed off of the African continent as slaves. Now, what this does to the African ecosystem is it's going to show them, just to sell, the value of the slave. And so Africa is going to contribute to the transatlantic slave trade because of the emphasis and the value placed on the selling of people, in many regards over many of the precious items like the gold and the silver that was there before. So we have to understand that you cannot talk about Africa and slavery and talk about it in the same vein that you would talk about, say, the transatlantic slave trade, the American slave trade, or European slave trade. It is definitely different. It's on a continuum, which means you can have free, almost independent status of not even knowing you're enslaved, versus to actually feeling the oppression of the labor-intensive of chattel slavery. It was not one way or the other. It was more so a continuum. And it wasn't a permanent fixed status that you were in for the rest of your life. You could be born enslaved, and within a matter of a few years, you could be released from slavery. You can buy your freedom, you can buy the freedom of your family, or you could not even have to ever recognize you're enslaved, because you're in a situation in which it doesn't feel like you're enslaved. You're just pretty much dominated by a kingdom or a group or a larger nation. And so we have to understand that it is different. It is not the same thing. It comes across as the same sometimes when we think about history, because we like to monolith things. We like to say slavery was bad and slavery was just what it was. But we have to understand that slavery is a social system. It's socioeconomic in some regards, but it's a social system, and it has many, many moving parts, and it's a lot more complex and complicated than just a simple one monolithic definition, thought, or perception of it. It's deeper than that. And so, that is African slavery. Yes, to answer the question that we opened with, yes, slavery existed in Africa prior to the Europeans coming in, prior to the Muslims coming in. Slavery existed in Africa. And that's something that a lot of people hadn't accepted over years, but we just have to accept, because the evidence, historians, we have written about this, it's been exhausted. We know this for many, many decades at this point, so it just is what it is. But the story gets greater about Africa, right? It's more than just slavery. It's more than just what we've been talking about. It's also great empires. When we think of empires, we think of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. We think of the great English Empire. We think of the great German and the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Empire. We think of all these great empires, but there were great empires in Africa. Oh, yes. There were great empires in Africa. In fact, the richest person to ever lived in Africa and was an emperor of an African empire. Did you know that? Oh. Well, guess what? You just gonna have to wait and see. Come back next week and we'll talk more about it when we discuss the great African empires and some of the other states that were just as powerful or powerful that were around them. So I look forward to seeing you all next week, same time, same place, at the Living for Black History series, where we are discussing Black history from Africa all the way to right now. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Smith, and you have a good night. Love you.